Welcome to Nightverse lore! Oh geez, another dimension of naps!
Hey there, sleepyheads. Glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. The rain had been falling for 3 days when Aunt Nora found him, a small question mark drawn in shadows against the weathered bench. It wasn't the kind of rain that hurried or demanded attention. This was patient rain, the sort that drummed gentle conversations with the station roof and made the amber lights wear soft halos like sleepy angels. The old terminal breathed quietly around them, its marble floors reflecting pools of buttery light, while the air carried whispers of wet wood, distant coffee, and something else, something that felt like a lullaby waiting to be remembered. Aunt Nora had been making her midnight rounds, her sandwich cart squeaking its familiar tune across the empty platform. She hummed without thinking, the same melody that seemed to live in the station's rafters, a tune that made the fluorescent lights blink slower and the clocks tick with more kindness. Her voice braided itself with the rain so gently that even the departure board seemed to settle, its letters glowing softer, less urgent. She had worked these quiet hours for 7 years, knew every creak and sigh of the old building, but tonight something made her pause near the furthest bench, the one tucked beneath the overhang where shadows gathered like old friends sharing secrets. The child slept with the profound stillness of someone who had found exactly where they belonged, even if they couldn't yet explain why. His coat was far too large, sleeves rolled back to reveal wrists thin as bird bones, and his pockets bulged with mysteries that clinked softly when he breathed. Dark hair escaped the collar, damp and clinging to a pale cheek, and his small hands rested palms up, unafraid, as if expecting whatever the night might offer. The bench itself seemed different somehow, warmer, more inviting, like a hearth that had finally been lit after a long winter of waiting. When Aunt Nora touched his shoulder, the boy's eyes opened without surprise, as if he had been expecting her arrival at precisely this moment. They were the kind of eyes that seemed older than their face, holding depths that suggested he had been listening to conversations the rest of the world couldn't hear. He didn't startle or cry for his mother. Instead, he sat up carefully, smoothed down his too big coat, and looked at her with the patient attention of someone who understood that kindness often came disguised as interruption. "Hello," he said, and his voice carried the same quality as the rain, steady, unhurried, belonging to this place in a way that made Nora's heart catch. "I think I've been waiting for you." She knelt beside the bench, her joints protesting softly, and studied his face in the station's golden light. There were no tears, no signs of distress, only a calm certainty that made her think of lighthouses, solid, purposeful, designed to guide others safely home. "What's your name, sweetheart?" she asked, though something told her she already knew. He reached into his pocket, past the collection of smooth buttons that caught the amber light like captured stars, and withdrew a folded square of fabric. It was linen, soft from many thumbings, with a single word embroidered in patient blue thread that seemed to hold its own gentle glow. "Ari," he said simply, handling the cloth with the reverence of someone carrying a prayer. "This is all I have, but it feels like enough." Nora had raised 3 children of her own, had seen every variety of lost and found that a train station could offer, but this was different. This boy wasn't lost, he was arrived. The distinction settled in her chest like a warm stone, and she found herself humming again. That melody that seemed to live in the station's bones, the one that made late-night travelers pause and smile without knowing why. "Well then, Harry," she said, testing the name and finding it fit the space perfectly, like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting years to open. "Are you hungry? I make a decent sandwich and the coffee's still warm." He nodded, but his attention drifted to the bench, his small hand resting on the worn wood with the familiarity of old friendship. "It's been empty for a long time," he said, though Nora wasn't sure if he meant the bench or something deeper. People need places to rest, don't they? Places where they can set down what they're carrying and remember how to breathe. The rain continued its patient conversation with the roof, and Nora felt something shift in the station's atmosphere, as if the building itself was exhaling after holding its breath for decades. As she prepared a simple sandwich, bread, cheese, a slice of tomato that somehow tasted like summer despite the autumn chill, she watched Ari settle more deeply into the bench. his too big coat spread around him like wings, and she noticed how the few late-night travelers began to slow as they passed, their hurried footsteps softening into something more like meditation. "You have a gift," Nora said quietly. Wrapping the sandwich in paper that crinkled like autumn leaves, Ari accepted the food with both hands, as if it were something precious rather than simple sustenance. "Maybe," he said, taking a small bite and closing his eyes to savor the taste. "Or maybe the bench does. Maybe some places are just good at holding people until they remember who they are." The folded lullaby rustled softly in his pocket, and for just a moment, Nora could swear she heard it humming along with the rain, adding its voice to the station's ancient song of welcome and rest. The night was beginning to turn, promising the first faint blush of dawn, and she knew that whatever came next would be built of small things done consistently, the way a song becomes a lullaby because someone sings it enough times that it remembers how to comfort hearts in the dark. By morning, the rain had gentled to a whisper against the station windows, and the platforms wore a soft sheen like polished silver under the early light. Aunt Nora moved through her morning ritual with the quiet devotion of someone who understood that feeding others was a form of prayer, each gesture deliberate and kind. She beckoned Ari to the small counter where yesterday's simple sandwich had become the foundation for something larger, a lesson in the architecture of care. "First thing to remember," she said, placing a loaf of bread between them like an offering, "is that kindness should reach the corners." Her weathered hands demonstrated the gentle pressure needed to spread butter across the surface. Not too thick, not too thin, but with the patient attention of someone painting light across canvas. Good bread holds what you're building without overwhelming what lives inside. It's the foundation that says, "Rest here, you're safe." Ari watched with the focused attention of someone learning a sacred text. The butter caught the amber morning light, and he found himself thinking of how the bench had felt beneath his small body that first night. Solid, reliable, ready to support whatever weight was offered. When he took the knife, his fingers moved with surprising certainty, as if they remembered skills from some other lifetime. The blade moved like a gentle tide across the bread, reaching every edge with careful strokes. "The filling," Nora continued, layering thin slices of cucumber with the precision of someone placing stones in a garden path. That's where you put your intention. Not just what tastes good, but what feels like hope. Something to remind people that sweetness still exists in the world. She added a paper-thin slice of apple, and Ari understood that this wasn't really about sandwiches at all. It was about creating small sanctuaries, portable moments of care that people could carry into whatever storms waited beyond the station doors. As they worked together, in comfortable silence, Ari began to notice the subtle changes that rippled through the early morning commuters. A businessman who usually rushed past with shoulders hunched against invisible burdens slowed near their cart, his pace gentling as he caught the scent of fresh bread and something else, something that felt like possibility. When Ari handed him a sandwich wrapped in paper that somehow stayed warm despite the morning chill, the man's entire face transformed, shoulders dropping as if he had just remembered how to rest even while standing. "You feel it too," Nora observed quietly, watching as Ari's presence seemed to stretch moments like warm taffy, giving people time to truly taste what they were eating, to notice the way morning light painted the station walls in shades of honey and gold, the way attention changes things, the way caring makes even simple food taste like comfort. Ari nodded, though he wasn't sure he had words for what he felt. It was like standing in the center of ripples, spreading across still water, each circle carrying something essential. Patience, perhaps, or the radical notion that everyone deserved to be seen, to be offered sustenance without judgment or hurry. Throughout the morning, he discovered that his focused attention could invite pauses to bloom not by force, but by patient presence and the right quality of listening. After the early rush thinned into the station's usual mid-morning quiet, Ari found himself drawn to walk the length of the platform. As he moved past ticket booths and empty waiting areas, he began reaching out, his fingertips brushing lightly against the smooth surface of every empty bench he encountered. It wasn't a conscious decision at first, more an instinct, a quiet greeting to these silent sentinels of human experience. Each touch felt like recognition. The wood seemed to hum faintly beneath his palm, a gentle vibration that acknowledged his presence with the warmth of old friendship. The folded lullaby in his pocket pulsed with quiet approval during these moments, its fabric carrying a subtle heat that seemed to emanate from within its simple stitches, as if it remembered being sung, remembered the comfort it was meant to give. Sometimes, when his attention grew particularly focused, the cloth would warm unexpectedly, and he would look up to find someone nearby who needed exactly what he was learning to offer, a moment of stillness, a gentle invitation to breathe. "It's not magic," Nora said later as they cleaned the cart surfaces with careful attention. "It's simpler than that and more mysterious. You're just giving people permission to slow down, to remember that they're human beings instead of just bodies moving through space." Ari began to understand that the bench from that first night had been teaching him something crucial, that presence was a gift he could offer, that attention given freely could transform the texture of time itself. When he settled onto its weathered surface during quiet moments, he felt the wood warm slightly beneath him, as if responding to recognition. The station's rhythm continued around him, but everything seemed to move with more intention, more kindness. A young woman approached hesitantly one afternoon, her eyes red with recent tears, and without thinking, Ari shifted slightly to make room. She sat beside him with the grateful collapse of someone who had been carrying too much for too long, and they shared the silence like a meal, neither needing to explain why this particular bench felt different from all the others. The lullaby rustled softly in his pocket, and somewhere in the station's gentle acoustics, Nora's humming blended with the distant sound of trains arriving and departing, creating a symphony of welcome. From across the platforms came another sound, fainter, but familiar, a melody that seemed to drift on the air like a thread connecting this place to somewhere else, somewhere that moved with water and carried burdens without complaint. "River's that way," Nora said, following his gaze toward the sound. "The old ferry runs there. The woman who pilots it has been humming that same tune longer than I've been here." She gave him a look that was both invitation and gentle promise. "Ferries and benches have a lot in common, you know. They hold you up until you reach the other side." The afternoon settled around them like a blessing, and Ari felt the first stirring of understanding that his gift wasn't something he possessed, but something he could become. A living invitation to pause, to breathe, to remember that even in a world that insisted on hurry, there were still places where time moved with the patience of rivers, where strangers could sit together and find their way back to themselves. Autumn arrived like a whispered secret, painting the station platforms in shades of amber and rust, each fallen leaf a small prayer settling into the spaces between stones. The air carried new scents now, the sharp sweetness of apples from distant orchards, the earthy promise of rain and something else, something that made the folded lullaby in Ari's pocket stir with recognition. It was on such an afternoon, when the light slanted through the station's great windows like honey poured slow and golden, that Jonah appeared. Ari felt his presence before he saw him, the way you feel a change in weather before the first clouds gather. There was a restlessness in the air, a gentle disturbance in the station's usual rhythm, like a stone dropped into still water. When he looked up from arranging sandwiches with Aunt Nora, he saw a figure moving along the far platform with the careful grace of someone who had learned to carry his home in the space between his shoulders. Jonah moved like weather itself, unhurried but purposeful, following currents invisible to ordinary eyes. His clothes bore the soft patina of many roads, and his hair held the wildness of wind and open sky. Yet when his gaze found Ari across the platform, something in his expression shifted, settling like dust after a long journey. He approached with the quiet attention of someone who understood that first meetings could determine the shape of everything that followed. "You must be Ari," he said, his voice carrying traces of distant places, the salt of coastal towns, the thin air of mountain passes, the particular silence of prairie nights. "I'm Jonah. I think we might be brothers, though I can't tell you exactly how I know that." There was something in the way he said it that made Ari's heart recognize the truth before his mind could question it. When Jonah settled onto the weathered bench beside him, the wood seemed to exhale with satisfaction, as if it had been waiting for exactly this wait, this particular arrangement of souls. The station's afternoon light gathered around them like a blessing, and Ari felt the peculiar sensation of a story beginning to remember itself. They sat in comfortable silence while the station's rhythm continued around them. Ari noticed how Jonah's presence added a different quality to the air, not the patient stillness that his own attention created, but something more like anticipation, the sense that stories were gathering just beyond the horizon, waiting to be discovered. When a distant train announced its approach with a long, mournful whistle, Jonah tilted his head toward the sound, with the automatic attention of someone who had learned to read the language of departure and arrival. "I know about clouds," Jonah said suddenly, as if continuing a conversation they had been having for years. He pointed toward the sky where afternoon clouds gathered, like thoughts collecting before sleep. "That one there, the one that looks like it's carrying rain in its pockets, that's what I call a sorrow bearer. It holds the weight until it finds the right place to let go. And that wisp over there, stretched thin as hope, that's a messenger cloud, the kind that carries news between distant places." Ari found himself leaning forward, drawn into this unexpected lesson that felt less like instruction and more like sharing secrets. As Jonah spoke, naming each cloud with the reverence of someone cataloging miracles, Ari felt something shift in the quality of time around them. The pauses between Jonah's words grew richer, deeper, filled with a peace that seemed to seep into the very wood of the bench beneath them. "Why clouds?" Ari asked, though he sensed the answer would reveal something important about this brother, who had appeared like weather himself. "Because they're always moving, always changing, but they follow patterns you can learn to read if you pay attention long enough," Jonah replied, his restless energy settling into something calmer, more centered. "They carry water from one place to another, bring rain where it's needed, shade when the sun gets too bright. They're useful without trying to be, beautiful without meaning to be." As they watched the sky together, Ari began to understand something new about his peculiar gift. It wasn't just about creating spaces where people could rest. It was about making room for connection, for the kind of recognition that happens when two souls discover they speak the same quiet language. The bench seemed to respond to their shared presence, growing warmer beneath them, holding the weight of their words like a keeper of promises. When the light began to gather itself for evening, Jonah reached into his coat and withdrew something small that caught the amber glow. It was a charm made from a bent nail, worn smooth by handling, attached to a thin chain that looked like it had traveled countless miles. "This was part of a railroad spike," he explained, placing it in Ari's palm where it rested with surprising warmth. "Found it on abandoned tracks in Montana. Sometimes the things that connect us outlast the purposes they were made for." The charm felt significant in Ari's hand, not heavy but substantial, like a promise made in metal and time. When he closed his fingers around it, he felt an echo of all the places it had been, all the moments when Jonah had touched it for comfort during the long solitude of traveling. "I can't stay long," Jonah said, though his voice carried no urgency, only the gentle regret of someone who understood the difference between wanting and needing. "I'm not built for staying, not yet. But I wanted to meet you, to sit on a bench with someone who understands that rest is sacred." As darkness settled over the station, they remained there, two figures sharing a silence that felt full rather than empty. When the last train of the evening announced its departure, Jonah stood with the fluid motion of someone always prepared to move, but he paused, his hand resting briefly on Ari's shoulder. "I'll come back when the seasons turn," he promised, the words carrying the weight of covenant. "Maybe by then I'll have learned to stay still long enough to really see what you're building here." As Jonah's footsteps faded into the night, Ari remained on the bench, the bent nail charm warm in his palm and the folded lullaby humming softly in his pocket. The bench seemed to hold the impression of their shared weight, a memory carved in wood and time. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the faint sound of water moving, and he thought of the ferry that ran downriver, carrying its own cargo of stories and songs, waiting to teach him new lessons about the art of holding steady while the world moved around him. The bent nail charm rested warm against Ari's chest in the days following Jonah's departure, a small anchor of connection that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of distant water. The station had settled into its winter quiet, frost painting delicate ferns across the great windows, and in that crystalline stillness, the river's call grew stronger. It was the same melody that lived in his folded lullaby, the tune Aunt Nora hummed without thinking, but now it carried new urgency, like a question finally ready to be answered. "The ferry runs every hour," Aunt Nora said one morning, wrapping his hands around a thermos of hot chocolate that steamed like small prayers in the cold air. "Marta's been piloting that crossing longer than the station's been standing. She might have words for what you're carrying." The path to the river wound through bare trees that stood like patient sentinels, their branches etched against the pale sky in lines of perfect stillness. As Ari walked, the charm swayed gently against his chest, and he found himself matching his steps to the rhythm of approaching water. The folded lullaby in his pocket grew warmer with each turn, as if recognizing something familiar in the melody that drifted on the winter air. The ferry landing appeared through morning mist like something from a half-remembered dream. The dock was weathered silver grey, worn smooth by countless arrivals and departures, and the water moved with the unhurried patience of something that had learned the value of taking its time. Moored at the pier's end was a small ferry painted the deep blue of evening sky, with windows that caught the light like gentle eyes. Marta stood at the helm with the easy grace of someone who had found her perfect place in the world. Her hair was silver as river mist, and her hands rested on the wheel with the confident touch of someone who could read water the way others read books. When she saw Ari approaching, her face broke into a smile that felt like sunrise after a long night, and she began to hum, the same melody that had been calling to him through season after season. "Well now," she said, her voice carrying the musical cadence of water over stones, "I've been wondering when you'd find your way down here. The river's been humming your song for months." Ari stepped aboard with the careful attention of someone entering a sacred space. As Marta guided them away from the dock, the engine's gentle thrumming joined the melody that seemed to rise from the water itself. The ferry's deck was worn smooth by weather and time, and everything spoke of patient service. Coiled ropes, brass fittings polished by loving care, seats that had held every variety of human story. "The river tells stories," Marta explained as they moved into the current's embrace. "You just have to know how to listen. See how the light catches those ripples there? That's laughter still echoing from yesterday's crossing. And that deeper current, the one that runs dark and steady, that's carrying someone's grief downstream, dissolving it into the endless flow." During the crossing, Ari noticed how passengers seemed to settle more deeply into themselves as the ferry found its rhythm. A businessman loosened his tie and smiled at a stranger's child. An elderly woman shared her thermos with a young student who looked like he hadn't slept in days. The bent nail charm warmed against his chest, and he understood. This was his gift in motion, creating pockets of peace where people remembered they were more than just their hurry. "You're doing it now," Marta observed quietly, nodding toward the transformed passengers. "Making space for what needs to happen. The river does the same thing, holds everything that's offered, carries it where it needs to go, never forcing, never hurrying." When they reached the far shore, Marta invited him to sit on a small bench at the ferry's bow, facing back toward the water they had just crossed. "This is where I do my real work," she said, settling beside him with deep contentment. "Watching, waiting, being the kind of person others can lean against without fear of falling." As they sat in comfortable silence, a great blue heron landed nearby, folding its wings with deliberate grace. It stood motionless at the water's edge, demonstrating the art of patient attention that Marta had been describing. Ari watched the bird with growing understanding, seeing in its stillness a mirror of what he was learning to become. "The hardest part," Marta continued, her voice blending with the sound of water against the ferry's hull, "is learning to wait without wanting, to be present without needing to fix or change, to trust that your being there is enough, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to hurry." As afternoon light began to gather itself for evening, Marta smiled at him with the warmth of someone sharing a treasured secret. "Your seat," she said, and somehow he knew she meant more than the ferry bench they occupied. "It's becoming a lantern, isn't it? The kind that doesn't blind or demand attention, but simply offers itself to anyone who needs to find their way." The return journey felt different, charged with new understanding. As the ferry carried them back toward the station, Ari felt the first stirring of something larger than his individual gift, a sense of purpose that connected his small acts of kindness to something vast and enduring, like drops of water joining the eternal conversation of rivers and rain. The folded lullaby hummed with quiet approval in his pocket, and the bent nail charm settled against his heart like a promise kept, carrying him forward into whatever gentle turning awaited next. The fairy's gentle lessons settled into Ari's bones like warmth from a well-tended fire, and when he returned to the station that evening, the bent nail charm pulsed softly against his chest with each step. Marta's words about being a lantern that couldn't be blown out had awakened something deeper in the folded lullaby, which now hummed with quiet recognition whenever acts of kindness moved through the world around him. The station felt different now, not just a place of arrivals and departures, but a vast tapestry woven from countless small moments where strangers chose to be gentle with one another. It was during the quiet hours between afternoon and evening, when shadows stretched long across the platforms and the light turned golden as honey in glass jars, that Ari first noticed the notes. They appeared like small prayers left for whoever needed them most, folded napkins tucked beneath sugar dispensers in the cafe, slipped into the spaces between magazines on waiting room tables, or placed carefully on windowsills where the light would catch them like tiny beacons. The first one he found read simply, "You are allowed to arrive late to yourself." The handwriting was careful and unhurried, each letter formed with the patience of someone who understood that words could be medicine when offered at exactly the right moment. Ari watched from across the cafe as a businessman with worry lines etched deep around his eyes discovered the note, read it twice, and then folded it carefully into his wallet as if it were something precious. More appeared over the following days, each one a small gift of grace. Water the plant inside your chest. Even the smallest light can warm a room. Remember to feed the small bird that lives behind your ribs. Ari began to understand that someone was moving through the station like a gentle ghost, leaving breadcrumbs of comfort for weary travelers who had forgotten they deserved kindness. He started watching more carefully, and that's when he saw her, a letter carrier with a worn leather satchel and eyes that held the particular wisdom of someone who had spent years carrying other people's hopes and sorrows from door to door. She moved through the station with purposeful grace, pausing occasionally to write something on a napkin with the concentrated attention of someone composing a prayer. Her movements carried the ritual quality of someone who had discovered a way to leave small gifts of light in unexpected places. When their eyes met across the platform one afternoon, the recognition was immediate and mutual, two souls who spoke the same quiet language of service. She smiled with the warmth of fresh bread, and when she approached, Ari felt the same sense of inevitable rightness he had experienced when Jonah first sat beside him on the bench. "I'm Sora," she said, as if they had been expecting to meet in exactly this moment. "I've been watching you work your gentle magic. You're the one who makes time slow down, aren't you? The keeper of the bench that remembers how to hold people." "I don't know if it's magic," Ari replied, settling onto a nearby stool with the careful attention he brought to all such moments. "Maybe it's just paying attention differently," Sora laughed, a sound like silver bells carried on morning air. "The best magic usually is." She gestured to the napkin she had just finished folding. "I leave these around the station, little reminders for whoever needs to find them. Nothing profound, just small seeds of the idea that someone out there believes in their capacity for joy." She told him about mornings when she felt invisible, delivering mail to people who saw only the uniform rather than the person wearing it. "So I started leaving notes," she explained. "First just to prove to myself that I existed, that my words could matter to strangers. But then I discovered something wonderful. The act of offering comfort to others was the fastest way to remember my own worth." They began meeting regularly during Sora's afternoon break, sharing simple sandwiches that Ari prepared with the same careful attention Aunt Nora had taught him. As they ate, they exchanged stories and napkin notes, never quite saying everything they meant but somehow communicating more than their words could hold. Sora taught him what she called the discipline of soft joy, how to find sacred moments hidden in the ordinary rhythm of days, how to reheat a memory until it warmed the hands like a cup of perfect tea. "Watch this," Sora said one afternoon, pulling out a fresh napkin and writing with deliberate care. "The heart has its own weather, and kindness is always in season." She folded it with the precision of someone creating origami and tucked it beside the salt shaker where someone would find it later, perhaps exactly when they needed to remember that gentleness was still possible in a hurried world. Ari found himself telling her about the bench in the rain, about Jonah's cloud reading and Marta's river wisdom, about the folded lullaby that seemed to pulse with recognition whenever true connection happened nearby. Sora listened with the quality of attention that made stories feel true again, as if her presence gave them permission to be meaningful rather than merely remembered. "You're collecting teachers," she observed, and there was something in her voice that suggested she understood the significance of such gathering. People who know different ways of holding steady while the world moves around them. They began creating quiet rituals, Thursday afternoons when they would brew tea that tasted like comfort, share sandwiches cut into triangles like paper boats, and write notes on napkins that would find their way into the world like seeds of unexpected grace. As winter deepened around them, and the station settled into its quietest rhythms, Ari felt something new stirring in his chest. Not just the gift of creating pause and peace, but the deeper understanding that love could be built of small gestures, repeated with consistency. That intimacy could grow in the spaces between words. One evening, as they sat watching the last light fade from the station windows, Sora reached across the small table and touched the bent nail charm that hung visible at Ari's throat. "Your brother gave you this," she said, and it wasn't quite a question. "He promised to return when the seasons turn," Ari replied, feeling the truth of connection that transcended blood. "And until then," Sora said softly, "you're learning to be the kind of person worth returning to. Someone who holds space for others to discover who they really are beneath all the hurry and worry." As she stood to leave that evening, Sora tucked one final napkin beside his empty cup. It read, "When you make a seat, you light a star." The words settled into his chest like seeds finding fertile ground, and Ari understood that whatever came next would be built from this. Small, tender practices repeated until they became the way a life glowed quietly from within, illuminating the path for anyone who needed to find their way home to themselves. The words Sora had left, tucked beside his empty cup that evening, settled into Ari's chest like seeds finding fertile ground. "When you make a seat, you light a star." For days afterward, the folded lullaby seemed to hum with quiet approval whenever he touched the napkin, as if the message had awakened something that had been waiting patiently for recognition. The bent nail charm rested warm against his heart, and he began to understand that Jonah's gift had been more than a token. It was a compass pointing toward connection that could outlast its original purpose. The idea came to him gradually, like dawn creeping across the sky, that his gift need not be confined to a single bench in one station. If he could create pockets of peace wherever he opened his heart to possibility, then perhaps the whole world could become a gentler place, one moment of stillness at a time. He shared this growing certainty with Aunt Nora one morning as they arranged sandwiches with the careful attention of people who understood that feeding others was a form of prayer. "You'll need something portable," she said, her weathered hands moving with practiced grace. "Something that carries the same intention as our bench, but can travel where the need is greatest." Together they found a small folding stool at a shop along the river, its wooden seat worn smooth by previous hands, its canvas back soft with age and use. When Ari ran his fingers along the grain, it hummed faintly in recognition, like joining a choir already singing. Aunt Nora helped him sand the edges until they were smooth as river stones, and when they wrapped it in a canvas bag that smelled faintly of lavender and old prayers, she offered words that felt like benediction. "It's not about the furniture, sweetheart. It's about the intention you bring to opening it, the quality of presence you offer when someone sits down. You're not just lending them a seat. You're lending them time to remember who they are beneath all the rushing." Ari began to walk the city with the stool in his canvas bag, choosing places to open it like a gardener, selecting where to plant seeds of unexpected grace. He discovered that certain locations seemed to call to him. The space outside the clinic at dawn, where worry gathered thick as morning fog. The corner by the laundromat at midnight, where loneliness spun in endless cycles. The quiet alcove beneath a row of sleeping windows, where dreams needed gentle tending. At first, people approached his small offering with cautious curiosity, unsure what to make of someone who simply sat and waited, without agenda or expectation. But gradually, as winter softened toward spring, word began to spread through the city's invisible networks of kindness. Whispered conversations between friends, knowing glances exchanged between strangers who had experienced something unexpectedly healing in the presence of the young man with patient eyes and the folding stool. Outside the clinic one morning, a man with a cough that sounded like sandpaper declined the seat at first. Then, after a moment's awkward dance with his pride, lowered himself onto it and found his breath slowing. Ari offered half a sandwich wrapped in brown paper that somehow held its warmth like a small hearth. The man took it, eyes glistening with surprise that had nothing to do with hunger. "I didn't think I needed to sit," he murmured between careful bites. "I thought stopping would make me weaker. But now I feel like I might actually make it through those doors." "Sometimes weakness is the body asking for a chair," Ari replied, and he didn't know he believed it until he heard it aloud. The man nodded as if he'd been handed a key, and when he stood to enter the clinic, his shoulders carried their burden differently, not lighter necessarily, but more evenly distributed. At the laundromat during the quiet hours when night workers waited for what was clean, Ari placed the stool near the humming rows of machines. A young woman with a backpack wider than her shoulders sat without asking, her fingers worrying a loose thread as she watched her clothes turn like weather in the dryer's round horizon. They didn't speak for a long time, the silence feeling like a blanket pulled up to the chin. When the cycle ended, she looked at him as if surfacing from a far place and whispered, "I forgot I was allowed to rest even while I was waiting." He began to map the city, not with streets and names, but with places where the air seemed to listen. A park bench under a sycamore, where a grandfather fed pigeons and memories with equal tenderness. The bus stop, where a tired nurse changed from clogs into walking shoes and pressed her thumb into her palm to coax her heartbeat into softer rhythm. Sometimes he left the stool folded and simply stood nearby, as if proximity were enough to invite gentleness. Sometimes he opened it without a sitter, and the empty seat did its work like a bell struck in an empty chapel, shifting the quality of the air for passers-by who didn't even know they'd heard it. Small acts accumulated like morning dew, each one insignificant alone, but together creating something that could nourish an entire world. He found a lost glove and waited until its pair came back looking small and anxious. The reunion happened with a smile that felt older than words. He shared an apple with a street artist whose hands were too cold to hold a brush. He taught a child whose parents were too preoccupied to notice their quiet distress, a lullaby that felt like a cloud settling gently on troubled thoughts. Each evening, he wrote postcards on small rectangles of sky-blue cardstock from the station newsstand. On each one he drew a tiny chair in blue ink, a small symbol that meant, "I kept a place for someone today." To Jonah he wrote, "Sat outside the clinic at dawn. Someone's courage arrived right on time." To Marta, "Listened to the river in a laundromat drum. You were right. Water carries what it must even when it pretends to be machines." To Sora, "Your seeds are sprouting everywhere. Found your words taped inside a bus shelter." Someone had underlined kindness twice. There were days when he felt like he was failing too, when no one took the stool, when his sandwiches came back uneaten, when the city's hurry drowned out his quiet offering. On those days, the folded lullaby would press gently against his palm like a small living thing asking to be held. And he learned to let the empty days be part of the rhythm, rather than a verdict. As spring began to paint the city in tender greens, Ari noticed something new happening. During a conversation with a nurse who had forgotten to eat because she was too busy feeding others' hunger for healing, he felt time itself growing more generous around them. The shadows lengthened more slowly. The light held its golden quality longer than seemed possible, as if the day was offering them extra moments to complete this necessary conversation. "I don't know why," the nurse said, looking around with wonder, "but sitting here feels like the first deep breath I've taken in months, like someone pressed a reset button on my entire nervous system." That evening, as he walked home through streets that seemed softer somehow, more welcoming, Ari began to understand that his work was becoming a kind of prayer made visible. The stool's canvas had darkened where hands had held it. The wood had taken on a burnish from countless small touches, and when he opened it now, there was sometimes the faintest scent of pears and pine. Like his future self had left a hint for the present to follow. The city lights twinkled like earthbound stars, and he felt the truth of Sora's words settling deeper into his bones. Each time he opened the stool, each moment of presence he offered, each small act of witness, they were all part of lighting something that couldn't be extinguished by wind or weather. Not stars in the sky, but something more precious, the gentle radiance that lived in human hearts when they remembered they were worthy of rest, of kindness, of being seen exactly as they were. The folded lullaby hummed its quiet approval in his pocket, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the faint sound of a train announcing its arrival, carrying new stories and fresh opportunities for the kind of gentle ministry that asked nothing more than presence, patience, and the radical belief that everyone deserved a place to rest while they remembered how to be human. The truth of Sora's words about lighting stars had settled into Ari's bones like warmth from a well-tended fire, and as spring painted the city in tender greens, something new began to unfold in the quiet spaces he created with his folding stool. It started on a morning when the air carried the promise of rain and the scent of cherry blossoms from the tree outside the children's hospital, where he had positioned himself with the careful attention of someone who understood that hope needed the gentlest possible tending. A woman approached with steps that carried invisible weight, her eyes holding the particular exhaustion that comes from loving someone whose pain you cannot take away. When she settled onto the stool, her entire body seemed to exhale months of held breath, and without prompting, she spoke into the morning air. "My name is Elena Rodriguez. I haven't said it out loud in weeks, I think. I've been Marcus's mother, and the woman in room 314 for so long, I almost forgot I had a name that was just mine." As the syllables left her lips, something extraordinary happened. Harry felt the name settle into the space around them, like music finding its perfect pitch. And suddenly, he could hear not just the word itself, but the way it had been shaped by a lifetime of being spoken. Eleanor, called with joy by a grandmother who smelled of cinnamon and prayers, whispered with tenderness by a husband who had learned to love her silences, shouted across playgrounds by children who needed her attention, like flowers needed sun. But there were other echoes too, places where the name had been worn rough by impatience or abandoned entirely, in moments when she had forgotten she was anything more than the sum of her responsibilities. The folded lullaby in his pocket warmed gently, recognizing this new dimension of his gift. As he poured tea from a thermos that somehow stayed warm despite the morning chill, Ari understood that names carried everything, all the love they had held, all the times they had been called home, all the ways they had been polished smooth by care or cracked by neglect. Throughout the following days, this pattern repeated with variations that felt like themes in a symphony he was learning to conduct. He began to ask gently, as one asks before touching something tender, "What name should I hold for you?" Some offered their names like gifts, others whispered them like secrets, and a few spoke them like prayers they had forgotten how to say. There was the man outside the clinic who said Robert, and let Ari hear the echo of an empty leash, the rhythm of morning walks that no longer happened, a love that was still looking for its dog. The nurse who returned after weeks spoke Patricia, with the frayed edges where it had been pulled taut over too many needs, though underneath lay the silver seam of kindness that had never broken. A student who felt invisible in bright rooms full of loud voices whispered, May like a small bird learning to sing, and Ari heard her grandmother's accent braided through the syllables, the proud emphasis her professor placed on each letter when reading her work aloud. Each time someone spoke their name to the stool, Ari felt the peculiar sensation of witnessing something sacred. Not just the sound of syllables arranged in familiar patterns, but the entire history of how that particular combination of letters had moved through the world, gathering meaning like a river gathering tributaries. He heard names that were smooth as buttons from well-loved coats, worn to gentle shine by years of tenderness. Others were cracked along the edges, sharp from being called too loudly in anger. A few were still brand new, tentative, like shoes not yet broken in. The stool itself seemed to be changing, its wood growing darker and more burnished with each story it held. Sometimes, when he folded it at the end of a long day, he could swear he heard whispers of all the names it had witnessed, not as individual words, but as a gentle chorus of human identity, a reminder that beneath every hurried exterior lived someone whose name held the entire history of how they had been loved and seen and called home. He never pushed for these revelations, never asked directly for stories. He simply opened the stool with careful attention, offered half a sandwich that somehow always stayed warm, and created the kind of silence that invited truth to surface naturally. When someone chose to speak their name aloud, he received it with the reverence of someone being trusted with something irreplaceable. One evening, as he walked through streets that had become as familiar as the lines on his palm, he paused beneath a streetlight and spoke his own name aloud to the gathering dusk. Ari, he said, and felt the weight of it, the mystery of its origin, the way Aunt Nora had spoken it with such immediate acceptance, the care with which Sora and Jonah and Marta had learned to hold it. His name carried the sound of rain on station platforms, the warmth of sandwiches shared with strangers, the quiet satisfaction of creating space where others could remember who they were beneath all their doing. The bent nail charm rested warm against his chest, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle announced another arrival, another departure, another opportunity for someone to discover that their name, their true, complete, perfectly imperfect name, was worth speaking aloud to a world that was always listening, even when it seemed too busy to care. The stool in his canvas bag carried the weight of all these discoveries, growing heavier and more precious with each life it touched. Each name it had been trusted to hold like a prayer, whispered to patient, ere the names Ari had learned to hold with reverence continued to echo in the quiet spaces between his heartbeats as autumn deepened toward winter, each one a small prayer that had found its way home. The folded lullaby in his pocket had grown warm more frequently in recent days, and the bent nail charm rested against his chest with the patient heat of something remembering its purpose. As the first frost painted the station windows with delicate ferns of ice, he felt the familiar stirring that meant change was walking toward him on quiet feet. Jonah appeared on an evening when the air carried the promise of snow and the scent of wood smoke from distant chimneys. He moved through the station with the same restless grace Ari remembered. But something in his posture had shifted. The weight he carried now seemed less like adventure and more like questions that had grown too heavy for one person to hold alone. When their eyes met across the platform, the recognition was immediate and mutual, like two parts of a song finding their harmony after a long separation. "Brother," Jonah said, settling onto the weathered bench beside Ari, with the careful attention of someone who had learned the value of stillness through its absence. The word carried all the seasons they had spent apart, all the postcards with tiny chairs drawn in blue ink, all the miles that had taught him the difference between moving away from something and moving toward it. They sat in comfortable silence while the station's evening rhythm continued around them, and Ari felt time stretching with the generous quality he had begun to recognize as his gift deepening. The pauses between arriving trains grew longer. The fluorescent lights seemed to blink with more patience, and even the distant sound of traffic softened into something more like meditation than urgency. "I feel like a room without a door," Jonah said finally, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion that comes from searching for something you can't quite name. "There's furniture inside and windows, and memories pinned to the walls like photographs, but no door. Ari, people knock, love knocks, hope knocks, even peace knocks, and everything has to climb in through the windows or not come at all." As Jonah spoke his name aloud in this new context, Ari heard it differently than before. Where once it had carried the salt of coastal towns and the thin air of mountain passes, now it held the echo of empty rooms, of footsteps in hallways that led nowhere, of a heart that had forgotten how to open properly. The folded lullaby pulsed gently in his pocket, recognizing the deep ache that lived beneath the metaphor. "Maybe," Ari said, surprised to hear wisdom in his own voice. "Doors aren't always built into walls. Maybe sometimes they're made of other things. Time, attention, someone willing to sit in the room with you until you remember what's inside." The next day they walked to the river together, drawn by the same ancient call that water makes to troubled hearts. Marta's ferry rocked gently at the dock, its blue paint softened by frost, and when she saw them approaching, her smile carried the warmth of someone who had been expecting exactly this arrival. As they moved into the current's embrace, the engine's gentle thrumming joined the melody that lived in Ari's pocket, creating a symphony of welcome that seemed to rise from the water itself. "Ah," Marta said, looking Jonah over with the kind of attention that didn't try to fix or change, only to see clearly. "You've been carrying weather that doesn't belong to you. Come sit. Let the river do some holding." They positioned themselves at the ferry's bow, facing back toward the water they had just crossed, and Ari opened his folding stool with the careful reverence he brought to all such moments. As Jonah settled onto it, something shifted in the quality of the afternoon light. Shadows lengthened more slowly than physics should allow, and the golden hour stretched like warm honey, as if time itself was offering them extra space for whatever needed to happen. The hardest part, Jonah continued, his voice blending with the sound of water against the ferry's hull, is that I can see everything inside the room, all the love I've collected, all the kindness people have shown me, all the moments when I felt truly seen, but I can't figure out how to let any of it matter. How to let it change me instead of just passing through me like light through glass. Marta placed her weathered hand on the ferry's rail, her knuckles bright as winter sun. Rivers don't have doors, she observed, not as instruction but as gentle remembering. But they still hold everything that's offered to them. They still carry burdens downstream. Maybe what you need isn't a door. Maybe it's learning to be more like water, letting things flow through you while still being changed by their passage. As they sat in the expanding quiet, Ari felt his gift working in a new way. Not just creating pauses where people could rest, but actually borrowing minutes from time itself, asking so gently that the universe said yes. The afternoon grew more generous around them, offering space for Jonah to speak the fears he had been carrying like stones in his pockets. I'm afraid of becoming a stranger to myself, Jonah admitted, his words carried away by the patient current, of losing the thread that connects who I was to who I might become. I keep moving because stopping feels like disappearing, but moving feels like never arriving. The bent nail charm grew warm against Ari's chest, and he understood suddenly that Jonah's gift had been more than a token. It had been a compass pointing toward this moment, when presence could offer what distance never could. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the folded lullaby, its fabric warm with accumulated kindness, and placed it gently in Jonah's palm. "Your name," Ari said softly, watching as Jonah's fingers traced the single-stitched word. "It's not lost. It's just been traveling, collecting stories to bring home. Maybe the room doesn't need a door. Maybe it just needs someone willing to sit inside it with you until you remember that being seen is the high, same as being found." As evening settled, over the water and the ferry carried them back toward the station. Jonah's shoulders had dropped their invisible burden, and his breathing matched the river's patient rhythm. The stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, each one a small light that had learned to shine steadily despite the vast darkness surrounding it. "I think," Jonah said as they docked, his voice carrying new textures of hope, "I might be ready to learn how to stay still long enough to see what you're building here. To let myself be found by the love that's been waiting patiently for me, to stop running long enough to receive it." The night air carried the promise of snow and the distant sound of trains arriving and departing, each one a reminder that some journeys led away while others led deeper into the heart of where you already were. As they walked back through streets that glowed softly under the amber lights, Ari felt the next chapter of his story beginning to unfold, not with grand gestures, but with the quiet recognition that love was built of small consistencies, of showing up again and again until presence became a form of prayer, until the simple act of making room for another person became indistinguishable from lighting a candle in the darkness of a world that had forgotten how much it needed gentle illumination. The snow that had been promising itself in the evening air finally arrived like a whispered secret, transforming the station into something softer, more forgiving. Jonah had taken a small room nearby, close enough that he could practice the art of staying without feeling trapped, far enough that the restlessness in his bones could settle gradually into something calmer. Each morning he appeared with the quiet determination of someone learning a new language, the vocabulary of presence, the grammar of being still. It was during one of these gentle mornings, when frost painted the windows with delicate ferns and the air carried whispers of distant coffee, that Sora arrived carrying something that made the folded lullaby hum with recognition. She moved through the station with her usual purposeful grace, but there was something different in her step, a lightness that suggested good news traveling toward the right ears. "There's a place I want you both to see," she said, settling onto the bench between Ari and Jonah, with the careful attention of someone who understood that some moments needed to be held gently. "It's tucked away behind the old reference section, where people have been leaving pieces of themselves for years." She led them through corridors most travelers ignored, Past shuttered newsstands and walls of old timetables amber with age. A plain door waited at the end, unmarked but somehow welcoming, and when Sora pushed it open, the air inside felt as if it had been filtered through leaves and patience. The reading room breathed quietly around them. Soft lamps made buttery puddles of light on scattered tables, and the scent of paper and tea moved through the space, like something alive. Shelves held boxes of anonymous writings, journal pages nobody claimed, letters never sent, poems carved from the heart's deepest chambers. A small handwritten sign by the entry read simply, "Stories that need to be heard." "This is where strays end up," Sora whispered, removing her coat with reverence. Words that people wrote when they thought no one was listening. We could give them back to the world with the care they deserve. Ari felt the folded lullaby warm in his pocket, and when he opened his stool near a table beneath the room's single window, something shifted in the quality of the afternoon light. Time stretched like warm honey, and the scattered pages seemed to exhale with gratitude, as if they had been waiting years for exactly this kind of attention. Jonah chose the first piece to read, a journal entry written on graph paper in handwriting that trembled with careful control. "Today I remembered that my mother used to hum while she folded laundry, and for the first time since she died, the memory didn't hurt. It just felt like love traveling through time to find me." As Jonah's voice carried the words into the room, Ari felt his gift working in a new dimension. The sentences seemed to bloom larger, slower, taking up their full rightful size in the air. Each word landed with soft weight, not rushing, not apologizing for its existence. The page itself seemed grateful to finally be heard. They began returning on Thursdays, creating a ritual without naming it. Sora brewed tea that tasted like comfort, sometimes ginger, sometimes chamomile, always steeped with care. Ari prepared sandwiches cut into triangles like paper boats. They would choose pages at random and read them aloud with the reverence of people returning lost prayers to the world. One afternoon, as winter light slanted through the window like honey, poured slow and golden, Ari read a letter written on hotel stationery. "Dear stranger who will never read this, I want you to know that kindness still exists. Today someone held a door for me without being asked, and for just a moment, I remembered what it feels like to be worthy of small courtesies." As the words settled into the room's gentle acoustics, Ari discovered something remarkable. When he held a sentence with both patience and respect, giving it time to breathe, the words seemed to turn toward him with trust. He could sense where a line had been carried too far alone, where its edges had grown brittle from neglect. When he read those forgotten fragments, he added warmth with his voice, the way you warm your hands before touching something fragile. Sora, reading across from him, often met his gaze at the end of a paragraph, quiet energy passing between them, like lantern light changing hands. A few others began joining their Thursday gatherings. A night shift cook who always arrived with the smell of onions and thyme in his coat, a custodian with hands like river stones, a librarian who spoke only when necessary, but listened with her entire being. "We're not just reading stories," Sora observed one evening, as they gathered the pages with careful reverence. "We're creating a place where words can remember they matter, where being witnessed is the same as being blessed." Jonah nodded. His restless energy settled into something deeper. "It's like what you do with the stool," he said to Ari, "but for stories instead of people, making space where things can be held without judgment." As they walked back through the station's evening rhythms, Ari felt gratitude settling in his chest like a stone warmed by sun. The bent nail charm rested against his heart, and the folded lullaby hummed its quiet approval. Somewhere in the distance, a train announced its arrival with a long melodic whistle, and he understood that love was indeed built of small consistencies, not just individual moments of kindness, but ongoing sanctuaries where forgotten words could find their way home to hearts that had been waiting to receive them. The snow continued to fall outside the station windows, each flake a small prayer settling into the spaces between stones, and the reading room waited with its lamps lit and shelves breathing, ready to receive more stories that wanted to become themselves in the careful air of Thursday light. The Thursday gatherings had become a gentle constellation in the rhythm of their weeks, each session adding depth to Ari's understanding of how attention could transform forgotten things into treasures. In the reading room's amber light, Sora's voice carried a letter written on hotel stationery. "Dear stranger who will never read this, today someone held a door without being asked, And I remembered what it feels like to be worthy of small courtesies. As the words settled into the room's gentle acoustics, Ari felt his gift working in that familiar way, stretching the sentences like warm honey, giving each phrase time to breathe and take root. Jonah looked up from the journal entry he'd been reading, his restless energy now channeled into something deeper. "These words," he said quietly, "they're not just being heard, they're being healed, given back their proper weight in the world." It was as they prepared to leave that evening, gathering the scattered pages with reverent care, that the crisis arrived. A young man burst through the reading room door with the desperate energy of someone whose world was collapsing in real time. His phone screen showed the cruel red sliver of a dying battery, and his hands shook as he stared at it. "Please," he said to no one in particular, his voice carrying the edge of someone who understood that some conversations couldn't wait for convenient timing. "My dad's at St. Gabriel's. The nurse said he's asking for me, but the battery's almost gone. I just need 1 minute to tell him." His voice broke, and the phone screen flickered once more before going dark. The man's name was Evan, and when he spoke it aloud, Ari heard everything it carried. Childhood scraped knees kissed better. Baseball games watched from bleacher seats, the particular silence that had grown between them over years of words left unsaid. The folded lullaby in Ari's pocket grew warm with recognition, and the bent nail charm pressed against his chest with unusual heat. Something stirred in Ari's chest that was different from his usual gift of creating pauses. This felt like reaching toward time itself, asking the universe for a loan so tender that refusal seemed impossible. Without conscious decision, he found himself opening his stool with careful reverence, inviting Evan to sit. "Say your name again," Ari said softly, feeling the air around them begin to shift. "Let it know why it's here." "Evan," the young man whispered, and as the syllables left his lips, Ari felt something vast and patient lean closer, curious about this request. The reading room's lamps seemed to burn steadier, and even the distant sound of traffic grew muffled. As if the world was holding its breath, Ari reached out with his attention in a way he'd never attempted before, not to slow a moment, but to actually borrow from time's endless reserves. He asked so gently, with such pure intention, that the universe seemed to nod in quiet approval. The air shimmered almost imperceptibly, and Evan's phone screen flickered back to life, showing just enough power for one call. The conversation that followed lasted exactly 1 minute, but it contained everything that mattered. Evan's voice found steadiness as he spoke words of love and forgiveness, told his father about the porch that no longer wobbled, about roses that had decided to bloom despite their pride. When the call ended naturally, and the phone went dark with finality, Evan's face held the peaceful exhaustion of someone who had said everything that needed saying. Ari felt the borrowed minutes settle around them like a blessing, then gently release back into time's natural flow. The weight of what had just occurred settled into his bones, not heavy with burden, but substantial with responsibility. The bent nail charm cooled against his chest, and the folded lullaby rested quiet in his pocket, both seeming to acknowledge that something sacred had just transpired. "Thank you," Evan said, looking at all three of them as if they formed a single sanctuary for his gratitude. It was enough. I thought it would never be enough, but it was. As they walked Evan to the station entrance, Sora tucked a napkin into his coat pocket. "When time sits with love, it learns our names." The snow had begun to fall, each flake a small prayer settling into the spaces between stones. Later, as they sat on the familiar bench beneath the station's amber lights, Ari tried to find words for what had happened. "It felt like time was willing to lend something," he said slowly. "Not take or steal, but actually borrow, with the understanding that it would be returned somehow, someday." "You asked for mercy," Sora observed, "and mercy answered." "But Ari, that kind of gift, it's not something to use lightly." "I know," he replied, feeling the gravity of new responsibilities settling into him like winter settling into trees. I could feel how precious it was, how much trust was involved. It's not something you do because you can. It's something you do because the need is so pure that refusing would break something important in the world. The night air carried the promise of spring and the distant sound of trains, each whistle a reminder that some journeys required more time than the schedule allowed. As he held the memory of that borrowed minute like a prayer bead, Ari understood that he had been entrusted with something beyond measure. the ability to ask time itself for small mercies when love made the request urgent enough, to bend the very fabric of moments. The folded lullaby hummed its quiet approval, and somewhere in the city, a father and son had found their way back to each other in the space of 60 seconds that would echo through eternity. The weight of that borrowed minute settled into Ari's consciousness like sediment in still water, changing the very texture of how he moved through the world. In the days following Evan's call, he found himself walking more carefully, listening more deeply, as if the universe had whispered a secret that required new forms of reverence. The station seemed to breathe differently around him, the amber lights holding their glow a fraction longer, the wooden benches warming more quickly beneath waiting travelers who didn't quite understand why sitting felt like coming home. Word began to spread through the city's invisible networks of need and kindness, carried on whispered conversations between friends, knowing glances exchanged between strangers who had experienced something unexpectedly healing. The stories grew in the telling as stories do, moving through coffee shops and bus stops, through the hands of letter carriers and the voices of night shift nurses who had learned to recognize miracles even when they arrived disguised as ordinary moments. It was Sora who showed him the newspaper clipping, tucked beneath a sugar dispenser, like one of her napkin notes. The headline read, "Local man known as Lonely God offers comfort to cities weary." When Ari read it, something unexpected happened. Laughter bubbled up from his chest, bright and startled, followed by tears that came from a place deeper than sadness. "Lonely God," he repeated, tasting the words like something foreign on his tongue. "I don't feel divine, Sora. I just feel attentive, present in the way water is present to a riverbed." "Maybe that's what divinity looks like when it's not trying to impress anyone," she replied, her voice carrying the gentle wisdom of someone who had spent years delivering other people's hopes from door to door. "Maybe it's just showing up consistently, making room for whatever needs holding." The name followed him like a leaf caught on his sleeve, bringing both recognition and responsibility he hadn't sought. Strangers began approaching with a mixture of reverence and desperation that made him uncomfortable, as if his simple gift of presence had been transformed into something larger and more mysterious than he recognized. Some brought offerings, sandwiches wrapped in careful paper, thermos bottles filled with soup, small tokens of gratitude that felt heavier than their physical weight. It was Jonah who suggested they travel, to let the stories settle and find their proper size. "You need to remember who you are beneath all the titles," he said one evening, as they watched snow fall past the station windows. "Before you were anyone's god, lonely or otherwise, you were just Ari, the keeper of a seat where people could rest." They began to journey together, first to seaside towns where salt air carried old sorrows like messages in bottles, then to hill country, where silence echoed in valleys that had been holding secrets for centuries. Ari carried his folding stool in its canvas bag, and wherever they went, he found places to open it, with the same careful attention he had always brought to the work. In a fishing village where the lighthouse had been automated for decades, he sat with an old keeper who missed the rhythm of tending something that guided others safely home. The man's name was Samuel, and when he spoke it, Ari heard the echo of foghorns and the patient devotion of someone who had spent his life being a beacon for others. On a mountain pass where wildflowers pushed through late snow, he opened the stool for a hiker carrying her father's ashes, unable to decide where to scatter them. Her name was Rose, and it carried the weight of promises made to dying hands and the tender burden of honoring love after it had changed form. The stool itself evolved with each encounter, its wood growing darker with the oil of countless palms, its canvas seat taking on the subtle impressions of grief and relief, hope and healing. Sometimes, when Ari unfolded it in a new location, he caught the faintest scent of pears and pine, as if his future self had left hints for the present to follow. The folded lullaby in his pocket hummed with increasing frequency, and the bent nail charm rested warm against his chest, both seeming to recognize that the work was expanding in ways that honored its original simplicity. In a city built around a river that had once powered mills, they met a mural artist who had heard the stories. She painted them onto the side of a brick building, a figure holding a small stool against a sky of gold dots, surrounded by words that made Ari's chest tighten with recognition. He kept a seat for everyone. I don't know if that's true. Ari said, studying the image that somehow captured something essential about his work without making it feel foreign. I just try to keep one seat, just one wherever I am for whoever needs it most. Maybe that's what makes it true, the artist replied, adding a final star to the painted sky. You're not trying to save everyone. You're just refusing to let anyone sit alone if you can help it. Each evening he wrote postcards on small rectangles of sky blue cardstock, drawing tiny chairs in blue ink, symbols that meant, I kept a place for someone today. To Marta, ferries and benches are cousins. I see it everywhere now. To Aunt Nora, your sandwiches travel well, still warm after impossible miles. To Sora, your stars on napkins are constellations in diners, lighting the way for strangers to find kindness. As spring painted the world in tender greens, Ari understood finally that he didn't need to claim or reject the title Lonely God. It was just another way people tried to hold something that couldn't quite be contained in ordinary words. The loneliness wasn't about being alone. It was about the sacred solitude required to hold space for others, the beautiful burden of witnessing the raw edges of humanity without judgment. The train that carried them home moved with the patient, rhythm of something that had learned the value of arriving exactly when needed, and through the windows, Ari watched the familiar landscape unfold like a map of all the places where kindness had taken root. The folded lullaby hummed its quiet approval in his pocket, and somewhere ahead, the station waited with its amber lights and weathered benches, ready to welcome them back to the work of making room for whatever needed holding in the gentle space between arriving and leaving. The train that carried them home moved with the patient rhythm of something that had learned the value of arriving exactly when needed. And through the windows, Ari watched the familiar landscape unfold like a map of all the places where kindness had taken root. The mural's gold dots still glowed somewhere behind his ribs, and the weight of that borrowed minute from Evan's call had settled into his bones like sediment in still water, changing the very texture of how he moved through the world. When they stepped onto the platform, the station received them without ceremony, amber lights wearing their familiar halos as if nothing had shifted at all, yet everything had tilted a few degrees inside Ari. The Lonely God name floated on the edge of hearing like a tide he chose not to wade into, and the folded lullaby in his pocket hummed with the recognition that their work was expanding in ways that honored its original simplicity while reaching towards something larger. It was Sora who brought the news that would reshape their season, arriving with the purposeful grace he remembered, but carrying something new in her step, a lightness that suggested possibilities opening like morning flowers. My routes changing, she said, settling onto their familiar bench with the careful attention of someone who understood that some moments needed to be held like soap bubbles. They're expanding the postal service to cover the hill country, places where letters arrive like small miracles because they're so far from everything else. As she spoke, Ari felt the same sense of inevitable rightness he had experienced when Jonah first sat beside him, when Marta had invited him aboard the ferry. This wasn't separation, it was growth, the natural expansion of kindness finding new territories to tend. How long? He asked, though his heart already knew the answer would be measured in seasons rather than weeks. Through summer, maybe into autumn, Sora replied, her voice carrying the gentle regret of someone who understood the difference between wanting and needing. But Ari, we can carry this connection with us. Let me show you something. She pulled from her satchel a small stack of sky blue postcards, the same shade as the ones he had been using to write to Jonah and Marta. We'll write every day, she said, demonstrating by drawing a tiny chair in blue ink on the first card. Your chairs, my words on napkins, will create a map of kindness that spans whatever distance separates us. And so began their season of tender distance, a time when love learned to travel through mail slots and rest in the spaces between written words. Each morning, Ari walked the city with his folding stool, finding places where peace needed tending. The corner by the bakery where worry gathered thick as morning fog, the park bench under a sycamore where memories needed gentle company. Each evening he wrote postcards in careful blue ink, drawing tiny chairs that meant, I kept a place for someone today and I remember you. Sora's letters arrived like small gifts from distant lands, each one carrying the scent of adventure and the particular wisdom that comes from carrying other people's hopes across unfamiliar terrain. She wrote of the shape of the moon in different skies, a sliver like a promise over rolling hills, a full silver coin hanging heavy over valleys where silence echoed with ancient patience. She described the taste of light on fresh bread from bakeries that smelled of yeast and hope, the way strangers became less strange when they were given a moment of genuine attention. Found a post office that doubles as a general store, one postcard read, and left a napkin by the coffee pot. Your hands are making miracles, one letter at a time. The postmaster smiled like sunrise. Another, delivered a package to a woman who lives alone with 17 cats and a garden that grows vegetables in the shapes of hearts. She invited me for tea and told me about her late husband's love letters. Some love travels through time as well as distance. Their correspondence became a quiet constellation in the rhythm of their weeks, each exchange adding depth to their understanding of how attention could transform forgotten places into treasures. The folded lullaby in Ari's pocket warmed whenever a new postcard arrived, and the bent nail charm rested against his heart with the patient heat of something acknowledging that connections could span vast distances without breaking. As summer painted the world in shades of gold and green, their letters began to carry a different quality, not longing exactly, but a gentle gravitational pull, like two celestial bodies slowly spiraling toward reunion. Sora wrote of finding a mountain lake that held the sky like a mirror, of a hill that seemed designed for watching the world remember how to be beautiful. Ari wrote of dreams where he sat beside still water under starlight, sharing sandwiches. That tasted like every journey they had taken separately, and every kindness they had offered to strangers. Then, on an evening when the air carried the promise of autumn and the scent of ripening apples, a postcard arrived with no return address, only a simple drawing of a hill beside a crescent moon reflected in water, and beneath it, in Sora's careful hand, "When you read this, start walking toward the place where the sky mirrors itself." He knew the place from her descriptions, from Jonah's cloud-reading lessons about how landscape could hold stories. The climb took him through streets that had become as familiar as the lines on his palm, past the clinic where he had first learned to borrow minutes from time itself, beyond the neighborhoods where his stool had opened beside bus stops and laundromats, creating pockets of peace in the city's gentle rhythms. The hill rose like a held breath above the surrounding valley, and at its crest, beside a mountain lake that caught the last light like a cupped palm holding liquid gold, he found her. Sora sat on a worn blanket the color of early mornings. Her leather satchel beside her like a faithful companion, her eyes holding the particular wisdom of someone who had traveled far and learned to carry home in the space between her shoulders. "Hello, Ari," she said, her voice as familiar and comforting as the scent of fresh bread, as the sound of rain on station platforms, as the melody that lived in his folded lullaby. He opened his stool beside her with the same careful reverence he brought to all such moments, and the earth seemed to exhale with satisfaction. As dusk deepened around them, the first stars appeared like pinpricks in dark fabric, and slowly a perfect silver coin of moon rose above the distant mountains. Below them, in the still waters of the lake, another moon appeared, trembling, perfect, a mirror twin that doubled the sky's quiet promise. "I brought us a sandwich," Sora said, pulling from her satchel something wrapped in paper that somehow held warmth like a small hearth. It seemed right to make one big enough for 2 moons. They ate slowly, the way you do when the food is only part of the nourishment. The bread tasted of sun and patience. The filling of gardens tended without expectation, of letters delivered with care, of kindness offered to strangers who had become less strange through the simple act of being seen. Between bites, they shared the stories their separation had gathered, the names Ari had heard and held with reverence, the forgotten poems Sora had found, tucked into mailboxes like seeds waiting for the right season to bloom. The wind moved in long, thoughtful sentences across the water, and the lake's mirror moon trembled slightly under the breath of evening, while the sky moon looked steady as a vow. They didn't speak of forever, because forever was too big for human mouths, too vast for the gentle intimacy of that moment under stars that had learned to shine steadily, despite the darkness surrounding them. "I don't need forever," Sora said finally, her voice not frightening the night, but joining its quiet symphony. I only need a steady place to put mine now. I'm here, Ari replied, and the words carried the weight of every postcard, every blue chair drawn in careful ink, every moment when he had felt her presence in the warmth of the folded lullaby against his palm. I'm here, and I'm learning that love can be built of small consistencies, showing up again and again until presence becomes a form of prayer. As the night deepened around them and the reflected moon held steady in its liquid mirror, Zora reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his like two melodies finding their harmony. The folded lullaby hummed its deepest approval in his pocket, and the bent nail charm settled against his heart with the quiet certainty that some connections, once forged in the patient fire of mutual recognition, could weather any distance, any season, any gentle turning that the future might require. Somewhere in the valley below, the city breathed its night song, and the station waited with its amber lights and weathered benches, ready to welcome them back to the work of making room for whatever needed holding. But for now, they were exactly where they belonged, two small figures under a vast, kind sky, learning that the most precious gifts were often the simplest ones: presence, patience, and the radical belief that love could be measured not in grand gestures, but in the consistent refusal to let anyone sit alone if they could help it. The two moons had witnessed their quiet reunion, and as dawn painted the hill in tender shades of rose and pearl, Ari and Zora descended with hands that still carried the warmth of starlight. The city received them with the gentle recognition of something returning home transformed, and the station breathed around them with its familiar rhythm. Though Ari felt the subtle shift that comes when love stops being a question and becomes a quiet certainty. Years moved through the station like patient tides, bringing changes that felt less like disruption and more like natural evolution. The bent nail charm had grown warm against Ari's chest with such frequency that its heat had become part of his heartbeat, and the folded lullaby hummed with deeper contentment, as if all the stories it had witnessed were finally harmonizing into a single endless song. His hair began to show threads of silver at the temples, like frost settling on autumn grass, and his eyes held the accumulated kindness of a lifetime spent in service to small mercies. Aunt Nora had retired with the gentle grace of someone stepping backward, out of a photograph so younger faces could come forward. Though her sandwich cart still bore the dents her hands had shaped into it, a nurse named Rosa had taken over the little counter, and her hum matched the river's tune without her ever having met Marta, an old melody that life seemed to teach people who needed to know it, passing from throat to throat like a blessing that forgot who started it. "There's room out back," Rosa said one afternoon, leading them through a narrow corridor to a small courtyard that had been waiting under morning sky. The patch of earth wore a patient expression, framed by brick warmed with sun. "This used to be for deliveries, but it's mostly empty now. Seems like a place that wants to be useful." Zora looked at the dirt and saw a field of benches. Harry looked and felt a hush that didn't push, only invited. Building began slowly with soft wood and careful plans. Jonah arrived carrying tools that had settled into his hands like old friends. He had practiced staying through a whole season now, and the steadiness of his presence held the space like a second pair of hands. They sanded planks until they felt like river stones, set posts in soil that had been hungry for purpose, and painted each bench the color of early morning sky, blue just shy of remembering the sun. On the undersides, where only the sitter's fingertips would find them, Jonah carved tiny stars so that even the unseen places wore light. Zora tucked napkins into the cracks between slats. "Sit until the noise forgets your name. You are not late for your own breath." Pear saplings arrived from a nursery up the hill, each tied with string that yielded like kindness. Harry had never planted a tree before, but he knew how to make a seat, and trees were seats arranged in vertical prayers. He spread roots with patient fingers and whispered the same word to each. Their names would be decided by the hands that held their fruit, but for now he called them welcome. The courtyard filled with people who discovered it the way one discovers a path by walking. A courier stashed her bike against the wall and sat with eyes closed, holding the handlebar as if the world might roll away without her. An older man came every morning with a thermos, sweeping leaves no one asked him to sweep, and humming an unfamiliar counter-melody that braided itself with Rosa's tune. It was then that the child appeared, small hands pressed against the glass partition, watching with the regularity of someone following an internal schedule, more precise than any posted timetable. When she finally approached their familiar bench, her voice carried the particular gravity of someone who had been practicing important words. "Are you the one who keeps seats for people?" she asked. Her name was Pip, and when she spoke it, Ari heard the bright snap of a twig underfoot, the quick intake of breath before a giggle, a future full of hand-built things. "My grandmother used to sit here," Pip continued, her small hand resting on the weathered wood. "She told me about a boy who appeared one night in the rain, who knew how to make time slow down so people could remember how to breathe." Over the following months, Ari began teaching Pip what couldn't be taught in words: how to open the stool with reverence rather than routine, how to listen until the air felt lighter, how to offer presence without needing to fix or change. She learned with the focused attention of someone who understood she was inheriting something precious. "You can touch it," Ari told her, kneeling to her height beside the folding stool. "But first we ask it to open." "How?" Pip asked, fingers hovering like small birds. "Gently," Ari said, easing the stool's legs apart with care that changed the air. "And only when someone needs to sit. It's good at knowing." Ari practiced stepping back, an art slippery as light in water. When a young couple argued by the gate, he felt the old urge to place the stool between them. Instead, he caught Pip's eye and watched her open the stool with careful intention, placing it at an angle that said, "Sit long enough to hear the part of your heart that doesn't shout." "Even kindness must breathe," he told Pip one afternoon, watching a businessman discover one of Jonah's hidden stars, his face transforming with wonder. "It must leave space for others to find their own strength." The garden learned to welcome on its own. People left small offerings on a shelf Pip built from scrap wood, labeled lost and found and kept. The benches remembered their purpose, and the pear trees grew toward light, their branches already promising shade and sweetness for seasons yet to come. As evening folded the garden into softer blues, Ari would sit alone on the oldest bench, feeling the tender pull at time's edges but choosing restraint. The mural downtown had begun to fade from weather, but someone traced the stars with fresh paint, not changing the picture, only reminding it of itself. The folded lullaby hummed its deepest approval, and somewhere in the city's gentle rhythms, strangers were choosing kindness, creating pockets of peace that would outlast any individual witness. The work had found ways to continue, growing beyond his hands into something larger, more enduring, a quiet legacy built not of monuments, but of moments when people remembered they deserved to rest. The garden had learned to breathe with its own rhythm, and as autumn painted the pear trees in shades of gold and rust, Ari felt time's gentle hand settling on his shoulder with the patient weight of an old friend who had been waiting politely for attention. Silver threads had begun to appear in his hair like starlight, gathering on a winter field, and the lines around his eyes spoke of laughter and quiet contemplation, of countless stories held with reverence. The folded lullaby in his pocket hummed with deeper frequencies now, as if all the stories it had witnessed were finally harmonizing into something larger than individual melodies. Jonah had found his door at last, not built into walls, as he had once imagined, but woven from the daily practice of showing up, of letting himself be found by the love that had been waiting patiently for him to stop running long enough to receive it. He arrived at the garden now with a woman named Claire, who laughed like wind chimes, and understood that some people needed to travel in circles before they could settle into stillness. Their children climbed the pear trees with the fearlessness of clouds, their voices adding bright notes to the garden's gentle symphony. Uncle Ari, they called him, though the relationship lived in choice rather than blood. When the youngest scraped his knee on the brick path, Ari offered the folding stool with the same careful reverence he had always brought to such moments. The child's tears slowed as he settled onto the worn canvas, and the garden seemed to exhale around them, offering its accumulated peace like a blanket pulled up to comfort a troubled heart. The letter arrived on an afternoon when the air carried the scent of wood smoke and the promise of winter. It was written in a hand as gnarled as river roots, carried by a ferryman Ari didn't recognize, speaking of Marta having gone to the quiet place rivers go when they are done being rivers. Her ferry had found a new pilot, but her humming still carried across the water on clear nights, a melody that remembered its way home. Ari walked to the river alone that evening, the bent nail charm warm against his chest. He sat on the dock where he had first stepped aboard Marta's ferry, watching the water move with its ancient, unhurried patience. "Thank you," he said to the moving current, to the memory of weathered hands on a ferry's wheel, to the lesson that holding steady while the world moved around you was both the simplest and most sacred work anyone could do. A great blue heron landed nearby, folding its wings with deliberate grace, and Ari felt her quiet presence now woven into the very fabric of the river itself. The mural downtown had begun to fade under seasons of sun and rain, its colors softening, edges blurring until the words became faint whispers on the brick. Yet someone had traced the stars with fresh paint, not changing the picture, but reminding it of itself, of the light it held. Below it, in careful letters that looked like Sora's handwriting, someone had added, "He kept a seat for everyone, and taught us to keep seats for each other." Ari smiled at the image, understanding finally that he didn't need to claim or reject the title. The loneliness had never been about being alone. It was about the sacred solitude required to hold space for others, the beautiful burden of witnessing the raw edges of humanity without judgment. He was what he had always been, a keeper of seats, a lender of minutes, a mender of the pauses between heartbeats. Pip had grown into the work with the focused attention of someone who understood she was inheriting something precious. Her small hands opened the stool with increasing confidence, and she had begun to hear the subtle differences in how people spoke their names, the places where syllables had been worn smooth by love or roughened by neglect. The garden responded to her presence with the same patient welcome it had always offered. "The hardest part," Ari told her one afternoon as they tended the pear trees, "is learning to let go thread by thread, preparing for your own gentle departure. Not because the work is finished, it never really is, but because the work has learned to continue without you." He began to practice this letting go, stepping back when his instinct was to step forward, watching Pip create her own pockets of peace in the city's gentle rhythms. The folded lullaby pulsed with quiet approval each time she opened the stool with reverence, each time she offered presence without needing to fix or change. Sora found him there one evening, sitting beneath the oldest pear tree with his back against bark that had grown familiar as a favorite chair. "The post office is transferring me permanently to the city route," she said, settling beside him on the bench they had painted together years ago. "No more hill country, no more seasons of tender distance, just morning deliveries to people who have learned to watch for my truck." They sat in comfortable silence while the garden's evening rhythm continued around them, and Ari felt the familiar sensation of a story beginning to complete itself, not with endings, but with the kind of fullness that comes when all the threads have been woven into something larger than their individual colors. "I've been thinking about what you said once," Sora continued, her voice blending with the sound of wind through leaves, "about love being built of small consistencies, about showing up again and again until presence becomes a form of prayer. And I think I'm ready to build something that lasts longer than postcards," she said, reaching for his hand with the same careful attention she brought to writing napkin notes for strangers. "Something steady enough to hold whatever comes next." The folded lullaby hummed its deepest approval in his pocket, and the bent nail charm settled against his heart with the quiet certainty of promises kept and new ones being born. Above them, the first stars appeared like pinpricks in dark fabric, each one a small light that had learned to shine steadily, despite the vast darkness surrounding it. As the night deepened around them, Ari felt himself loosening threads with the patient attention of someone untying knots that had served their purpose. The work would continue, in Pip's careful hands, in the benches that remembered their promise, in the reading room where forgotten words found their way back to hearts that needed them. The city, held and holding, would go on breathing in that slow, generous way it had learned from a boy who once sat very still in rain until the world remembered it could rest. The garden breathed around them like a living prayer, and somewhere in the distance, a train announced its arrival with a long melodic whistle, carrying new stories and fresh opportunities for the kind of gentle ministry that asked nothing more than presence, patience, and the radical belief that everyone deserved a place to rest while they remembered how to be human. Winter loosened its grip slowly, the way an old friend lingers on the doorstep with one more story to tell, and Ari found himself moving through days that felt increasingly like afterglow, warm, unhurried, made of the soft gold that appears when the sun has slipped just out of sight but has not yet left the world. The seasons had turned like pages in a well-loved book, and he had grown into a calm old man whose hands carried the scent of pears and pine, whose eyes held the accumulated kindness of a lifetime spent in service to small mercies. The garden breathed with its own rhythm now, a living sanctuary where pear trees had grown tall and heavy with fruit, their branches casting dappled shade over benches painted the color of early morning sky. The folded lullaby had become part of his heartbeat, humming with such deep contentment that sometimes Sora would catch him smiling at nothing, his hand resting over his pocket where the fabric held all their shared stories like a prayer book, written in moments rather than words. The bent nail charm had worn smooth against his chest, polished by decades of quiet devotion, and when the light caught it just right, it gleamed like a small star that had learned to shine from within. Pip had blossomed into the work with the natural confidence of someone who had never doubted that kindness was the most practical skill anyone could master. Her hands opened the stool with practiced reverence, and she had begun to travel the city on her own, finding places where peace needed tending. The bus stop where morning commuters forgot they were more than their destinations, the park where elderly couples fed pigeons and memories with equal tenderness. When she returned each evening, the garden seemed to exhale with satisfaction, recognizing its future in capable hands. Sora moved through mornings beside him with the ease of a prayer learned by heart. They lived not in declarations but in habits, a thermos shared, a quiet note left where the other would surely find it, a tiny star drawn in the corner of the grocery list, a sandwich split cleanly down the middle and wrapped in paper that seemed never to lose its warmth. Her postal route still brought her through the station, and she still left napkin notes in unexpected places, small seeds of kindness that continued to sprout in the city's weary heart. Your kindness has a long memory. The heart speaks fluent hope, even when the mind forgets the words. Jonah brought his children to chase light across the brick and count the carved stars underneath the benches, each discovery punctuated with gasps that made the trees tremble as if laughing along. The restlessness that once hummed in his bones had settled into something deeper, a tide governed by the moon rather than storms. He wore the bent nail charm now, having learned that some gifts were meant to travel full circles before finding their true home. One crisp autumn afternoon, with the sun low and long shadows stretching across the garden like gentle fingers, Harry found himself moving with the deliberate grace of someone handling fragile glass. The folded lullaby warmed in his pocket, as if greeting a dear friend, and he understood with perfect clarity that the time had come for the final passing of gifts. "Come," he said to Pip, his voice carrying every bench and ferry, every napkin note and borrowed minute, every hello and soft goodbye he'd ever held. He placed the folding stool between them, its wood burnished to a deep shine by countless stories, its canvas seat faded but strong. "I've been keeping this for you." Pip's hands hovered, then settled with the reverence of someone touching piano keys for the first time. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," he replied, and she nodded with her whole body, understanding that she was inheriting something precious beyond measure. The garden seemed to tilt slightly, acknowledging a transfer of gravity, as light sifted through pear buds and caught in her hair. To Sora, he offered the folded lullaby, its fabric now so soft it felt like spun breath, the single-stitched word Ari, almost indistinguishable from the threads of time. "You've always known who I am," he said, smiling in that crooked way she loved. "Keep it with the other letters. Let it find its way into the right pockets now and then. I'll read it aloud on Thursdays," she promised, her voice thick with love and understanding. In the quiet room, when the lamps are low, when words remember their weight. As evening pressed its cool palm against their cheeks, they lingered in the garden while it did what it had always done: make room. A young mother discovered one of Jonah's hidden stars and smiled with wonder. An elderly man placed a single pear leaf on the shelf labeled "Lost and Found and Kept," as if to say, "This one is for the season that changed me." Rosa brought out mugs that looked like small planets and poured tea that smelled of roofs after rain. The mural downtown had faded to gentle whispers on brick, but the stars someone kept retracing glowed with steady persistence, reminding anyone who looked that light could outlast the surfaces that held it. The city breathed around them with the patient rhythm they had all learned from a boy who once sat very still in rain until the world remembered it could rest. "Do you hear it?" Zora asked quietly as the first stars began to pin themselves into the velvet sky. I do, Ari said, closing his eyes to listen more fully. The tune lived in the rafters of the world, in Riverlight, in the hush of the station's late-night heart. It had traveled a long way to arrive here. At this precise moment, a lullaby older than ink, softer than any single breath, stitched through with buttons, lanterns, sandwiches, stars. He walked to his favorite place, the oldest pear tree, its bark a map of seasons and stories. Keep the doors unlocked, he told them, gesturing toward the garden gate that had never needed a lock because it had always been meant to welcome whoever needed sanctuary, for whoever comes looking for a place to sit until they remember who they are. He leaned back against the sturdy trunk, feeling the earth breathe beneath him, listening to the city hum its ancient, complicated rhythm, a symphony of human longing and quiet hope. The night carried the far-off hymn of trains, the rustle of pear leaves rehearsing spring, the soft footfall of Pip checking the latch, the slow river sound that lived in Marta's humming. He felt the first rain he had ever known. Though the sky was clear and full of promise, just the memory of that first night, a hush set gently on wood, a breath that belonged equally to him and to the world. Sleep did what it has always done for the willing. It gathered him up with kindness and placed him gently where he had been traveling all along, not away but deeper, into the soft room where every good moment continued, where benches never splintered, where time offered its hand with patient grace. And with that, he stretched into the stars, becoming part of the eternal story of human tenderness, leaving behind a world made softer by his presence, a garden where benches remembered their promise, a city where strangers still chose kindness, a reading room where forgotten words continued to find their way home, to hearts that had been waiting to receive them. The pear trees rustled with contentment, and somewhere in the gentle darkness, Pip opened the stool for a late-night wanderer who had forgotten they deserved to rest, carrying forward the work that would outlast any individual witness, the radical belief that everyone, absolutely everyone, was worthy of a seat where they could remember how to be human. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay.